Okay, thank you so much for these kind words. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks, Alexandra, for setting all of this up. I'm really happy to be speaking to you today, especially given the complicated situation in my home country. So, yeah, I really want to emphasize the importance of keeping the lines of communication open in academia. So I'm very happy and honored and privileged to be speaking to you today. Okay, so a little bit about myself. As you heard, I'm a professor of late antique and early medieval history. I'm mostly focused on the Merovingian period, so that means anywhere from the 5th to the 9th centuries, even though, well, broadly speaking, 5th to the 8th, but yeah. And I'm really interested in Merovingian historiography and symbolism and patristic literature and biblical exegesis. So these are all pretty particular fields of interest that have really nothing to do with artificial intelligence. So you might be asking yourselves, why was I brought here to talk about artificial intelligence? Well, 2 years ago, I kind of began my pivot towards the field of generative artificial intelligence. 2 years ago, actually exactly 2 years ago, was the launch of ChatGPT, which has crashed on all of us like a tsunami and has really forced us to reconsider what it means to be an academic in today's world. So it really began as a personal hobby, I want to say. I started messing around with image generation. But then once I got the hang of ChatGPT, I really started to think what this means for historical pedagogy and historical research. And it has kind of worked itself pretty integrally into my research pipeline. And I really want to share my experiences working with this today. So in terms of recent projects, I've worked on AI-centric projects like creating an academic teaching assistant at my home institution of Bar-Ilan. This academic year is the first year where we have academic assistants that are AI-based for students to interact with. We have 20 courses that are currently online, and we're working on expanding this. Another project that I was involved with and that I will be happy to elaborate upon in the Q&A section is the composition of a generative AI ethics code. Because really I think the ethical question is a question that always comes up when everybody talks about artificial intelligence. I'm not going to go deep into ethics during this presentation, but not because I don't think it's important. It really is very crucial and important for us to come to terms with the ethical dimensions of generative AI. I'm just worried that if I do, it will eat up all of my presentation. So we'll stay focused on methodological concerns, but then if you have any ethical questions, I would be more than happy to discuss them later, okay? And finally, I teach a course on AI, and it's called Artificial Intelligence Practical Applications. And again, I'm more than willing to share my resources, so if any of you are thinking about incorporating this kind of pedagogy into your institution, do not hesitate to reach out. Okay, in the Polish context, I think the union between generative AI and history is perhaps timely, since the scandal with Polish off-radio in Krakow has made the rounds recently. So I don't know if some of you know, some of you don't know what happened there, but Off Radio Krakow has launched this interesting project, let's call it, where it replaced human hosts with AI presenters. And they're supposed to be Gen Z presenters. And it aired a fake interview with the deceased Nobel laureate Wisława Szymborska, who passed away in 2012. What happened was that the station used ChatGPT to generate the words of both the interviewer and the interviewee, and then it proceeded to use a software developed by the company 11 Labs to create the voices of the hosts and of the deceased Ms. Szymborska. And it had the desired effect because Off Radio jumped from near zero to 8,000 listeners in one night. But it also had the effect of eliciting a lot of public outrage. And the station was forced to pull other interviews that it had already prepared with the deceased Prime Minister of Poland and other celebrities, and to scrap the AI hosts. Now, the fact that this happened in Poland is perhaps not coincidental because, as you may or may not know, 11 Labs, which is the standard and the leading company in text-to-speech voice generation, is a San Francisco-based company, but founded by two Poles. And 11 Labs is meant to reflect the date of Polish independence. So, make of that what you will. But as I hope to convince you today, generative AI has less nefarious dimensions and can actually be quite helpful to be incorporated into historical research. So, what is the purpose of this presentation? Okay. What I want to do today is to explain how generative AI introduces new methodologies into historical studies. I'll show you how I personally recently used generative AI to carve out new research niches. And I only plan to do this using freely available, or let's not say, oh, that's not good. It wants me to log on to the, okay, just a second. Okay. So I think we're all good again. So to use only accessible and available tools. So nothing too technical, nothing too proprietary, nothing too complicated. So I'm talking at the level of ChatGPT and Anthropic Claude and Google Gemini. So these are all tools that once this paper is over, you can all go out and experiment for yourselves. This is nothing that you need to buy fancy software for. And like I said, I'm an early medievalist, so I will present examples taken from my own research, but of course, all of what I present today is fully translatable to other subdisciplines of historical research, such as modern history, right? Actually, I think there are more avenues in modern history that are not as available to me, being a medieval historian, such as oral history, public history, history of film, all of these fields where generative AI may have a significant impact, like transcription and analysis, sentiment analysis, analysis of cinematographic techniques, and all of these fields are actually being used as we speak in other fields with AI. So what I want to do is demonstrate 4 use cases that I've personally used, and to bring an historical example for each, okay? So, what I want to do is I want to demonstrate contextual search in the sermons of a 6th century Gallic bishop named Caesarius of Arles, which some of you early medievalists might know and love. I want to draw out semantic insights from an early modern Hebrew chronicle composed in the 16th century in northern Italy by a Jewish physician named Yosef Cohen, who I've worked on, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the following. I want to do visualization and network theory and prosopography in a collection of 7th century Merovingian hagiographies in Latin. And finally, and this is the most experimental aspect of this presentation, I want to do micro-historical analysis and generation of synthetic data in order to run some simulations and scenarios about a specific corner of history, which is the forceful conversion of the Jews of Minorca in the 480s. Okay, so let's start out with use case 1, with Caesarius. So what was the objective here? The objective was to demonstrate how generative AI can do contextual search. And what that means is that when we do search, we're usually accustomed to use key phrases, right? We look through the text and there are key phrases that interest us. AI search is very different because it searches for ideas. It is contextually aware. So we can ask the AI model to compare, to look for similarities, and to offer up ideas about terms and notions and concepts that are pretty fuzzy and obscure, right? And have it understand and infer from the context, okay? So I was personally interested in concepts of sensory imagery in the sermons of Caesarius. Sensory meaning like of sight, of sound, of smell, of touch, right? And I was also interested in the way that Caesarius talks about cleanliness and pollution, so themes of hygiene and how that relates to spiritual advancement, okay? And what I did was I used AI to identify thematic elements that were not explicitly stated. So Caesarius never says hygiene, he never says pollution, but he talks about relating terminology. And this is very useful for exploring themes across a body of work, and it goes beyond key searches. So it understands concepts and it finds passages with relating idea. So how did I do this? Well, it's really, really very simple, and all of you can do this right after the talk. I used custom GPTs by the paid model of ChatGPT. I took the sermons themselves, I uploaded them to the bot, and then I gave it a system prompt, which I will show you in a minute, that talks about how I want the AI to read Caesarius and what kinds of responses I want it to give me in return. Okay, so let's take a minute to experiment with Caesarius bot. And I really hope this works, because if it doesn't, that would be terrible. Okay. It opened, but let's just hope that, yeah, there it is. It's opening, but it's going slowly, so bear with me for a minute. Oh, there it is. Caesarius bot. So I might have to maybe do this. Yeah? Okay. So there it is. This is Caesarius bot. And as you can see, it's got a nice system prompt that shows it all the ways it needs to understand the sermons. And here are the actual sermon volumes. Okay? So in this part of the presentation, I'll ask some questions, but if you have ideas about the kinds of questions you would like me to ask Caesarius bot, by all means, right? Let's try and knock it on its butt, as it were. So, hello, Caesarius bot. And then it goes and searches its knowledge. Now, and there it goes. Blessed are those who seek the wisdom of Caesarius. How can I assist you today? Okay. I am interested in the connection Caesarius makes between spirituality and hygiene. Yeah. Does he talk about bodily pollution as a sign of spiritual pollution? So it's thinking, and here it is. Baptism as spiritual cleansing, right? Bodily pollution reflecting inner sin, moral hygiene, warnings against returning to pollution, physical cleanliness and ritual purity, hygiene as a moral duty, and on it goes. And we can have him give us specific examples. And so it searches the knowledge, and this might take a minute, but there it goes. Okay, so it produces snippets from the actual sermons, and then you can go and check for yourselves. Okay? Okay, let's give it another question. I gave him, so you can either give him English, or you can give them Latin, or you can give them pretty much anything. So if you're comfortable with the translation, you can do that, but this specifically is the translations because I didn't have the Latin scanned. But for the other bot I show, it's the original Latin, and it does just as well. What about trees and fruit and gardens? Where do those figure in the sermons, and how are they used? So as you can see, I'm specifically asking fuzzy questions, right? This isn't like pointed questions. And so it leaves it up to the bot to figure out what it is that I want, okay? So he employs the imagery of trees, the elm and the vine, the fig tree, Sermon 162, and on it goes, right? So, I think we've seen enough of Caesarius, and we'll go on to other examples, but I can give you a link to this conversation, but also to the actual bot. So if you want to play around with it after this is all over, reach out. I'm happy to share. Okay, so now let's go back to our presentation. Okay, so this is the system prompt, as you can see, okay? It covers things like sensory language, purity and pollution themes, continence and self-control, and so on and so forth. This isn't very long, but it is very detailed, so I really had the bot think through the ideas that I wanted it to bring out, to tease out of the text. But of course, if you're interested in other themes, you will need to tweak the system prompt accordingly. To be perfectly honest, I didn't write this. I had AI write it, right? So it gets kind of meta in that respect. I told the AI through an iterative conversation, this is what I want, ask me questions until you're sure that you understand what I mean. And once it did, it asked me a series of questions, and I tried to be as detailed as possible, and I ended up with this prompt. Of course, if this prompt doesn't deliver, I can always go back and iterate. And this is a really important point, that AI is an iterative process. It's a conversation between yourself and the system, so it's never full and complete. It's always in the process of getting better, okay? So let's do the second example. Okay, so the second example is, how am I for time? I'm okay. Is a linguistic emphasis bot. So what I tried to do was do linguistic analysis on a historical source. The source being Sefer Divrei Hayamim lemalkei Tzarfat ulemalkei Bet Ottoman HaTogar, which is a long mouthful, meaning the Chronicle of the Kings of France and of Ottoman Turkey. Okay, this is a very, very special source. It's a chronicle composed in Genoa in the 1540s-ish by a physician, a Jewish physician named Yosef HaKohen. And this is really out of my wheelhouse because I'm a Merovingianist and this is early modern stuff. But it turns out that Yosef HaKohen composed his chronicle on the kings of France starting with the Merovingian period. So what we have is a Jew writing in the 16th century in 16th century Hebrew about the Merovingians, which is, you know, it's great. So I naturally I had to read it and I had to analyze it, and so, you know, that's what I did. So what I want to do in this demonstration is to look for narrative features, by which I mean authorial style and conscious employment of language. So I really didn't have the text of the chronicle in digital form. I only had it as a hard copy. So what I did, I just used my phone, I took some pictures of the text that I wanted, I uploaded the pictures to Google Gemini, and I said, extract text. And it did, in Hebrew, perfectly. And then I proofed it, and it was error-free. So this is not part of the presentation, but it is a kind of hack, so I invite you to use this, okay? And then I took the text, and I input it into my AI tool. And I used a tool that you probably know, which is Anthropic Claude. So Claude is a competitor of ChatGPT, but it is known to be more semantically sensitive. So if you're looking for a good all-arounder, then I would definitely say ChatGPT, but if you're looking for something that has semantic sensitivity and really profound understanding of text and subtext, definitely go with Claude. Okay, so I opened up a Claude project and I uploaded the text, but alongside my text, I uploaded my own articles that I wrote on Yosefa Cohen. And why did I do this? Well, I wanted Claude to understand my research perspective and to understand the kinds of things that I'm trying to get out of the text. And I didn't want to have to explain this whole thing to the bot. So I just had it read my articles, and then we were on the same page, okay? So again, I'm going to have to quit the presentation and to show you what Claude looks like. Okay, so this is Yosefa Cohen's Carolingians. That's the name of the project. And as you can see on the right-hand side, the upper right-hand side, there are two files. One is the actual text in Hebrew, and the other is an article that I wrote for Traditio on chronicling the Merovingians in Hebrew, which gives the bot everything that it needs to know about the kind of research approach that I have with regard to the text. Another thing that I have is, again, a system prompt, okay? I set custom instructions. So, now I can have a conversation with the text, okay? So I'm not going to show you exactly the conversation that I had. I'm going to show you the results of the conversation that I had. It will be more time efficient. So let's get back to this. All right. So what did I produce? Okay, well, I looked at several metrics that interested me. I looked at the number of mentions of specific monarchs. This is specifically the Carolingian chapters of Divrei Hayamim, of this specific text that I was looking at, and I really wanted to see how many times each king was mentioned to kind of understand what Yosefa Cohen was trying to do in terms of like the narrativity of the text, where he's more interested, where he's less interested, and whether he's trying to tell us something about dynastic fortuna and about longue durée historical trends. And so, as you can see, Charlemagne is the star of the show. I don't think that's very surprising. But then with Charles Martel, Louis the Pious, Pippin III, and we get a decreasing return until we get to Louis III and Hugh Capet and Louis the German, who are really trailing behind. So this is interesting in and of itself, but when we look at it across time, we definitely see the narrative trend. And mind you, these graphs were all produced by the AI. I just had it visualize my own questions. I said, okay, tell me how many times each of the kings mentioned in the text is actually mentioned. So it went ahead and it counted, and then I said, okay, so give me a nice bar chart to visualize this. And it went ahead and did it. And then I said, well, okay, this is very instructive, but I really want to have it across time. So it did. And then I said, okay, give me a trend line. And it did. So this is all natural language, okay? I didn't have to write any code. I didn't have to do anything spectacular. I just asked simple questions, right? And so, okay, the next thing that I wanted to do was I wanted to see the kinds of words that Yosefa Cohen uses to talk about the specific characters in the text. So I looked at monarchs and their adjectives. And so I had Claude analyze what kinds of adjectives were positive, right? And what kinds were like favorable, which were critical, and which were neutral. And again, as you can see, Charlemagne is entirely positive, favorable, and then Louis the Pious gets more coverage, but a lot of that is, right, critical, negative coverage. And on both sides, you can kind of get a sense of what HaKohen is trying to do in terms of his own regard of where the dynasty is going, okay? And finally, after looking at adjectives, I looked at verbs. And I wanted to see which were verbs indicating the persons were active and which verbs were indicative of persons being acted upon. So active and passive verbs, okay? And again, you can see that Charlemagne conquers, Charlemagne subjects, Charlemagne legislates, Charlemagne does active things. And then when you look at other kings like Theodoric IV, who was the puppet king of Charles Martel, he is told, he is acted upon, he is instructed, and so on. Okay? So, what does this all tell us? Well, visualization is a tool that enables us to examine terminology, to examine temporality, because we can do wide analyses over time, and it can examine the kinds of attention that is devoted to certain themes and certain topics. And all of this allows us to get a clearer understanding of larger trends, such as the author's understanding of the role of what a dynasty is, how it grows, how it reaches a peak, and then how it declines. So really an understanding of the author's own historicity and historical perceptions, okay? So the third example that I want to show you is the network one. So here my point was to chart the connections between certain characters, all of whom appear in a corpus of hagiographical works composed in Latin in the late, or covering the late 7th century. And the person of interest here, this hairy guy with the beard and the sword, is Ebroin. So for those of you who are not into Merovingian history, Ebroin was the mayor of the Neustrian palace. And he was not a popular person, okay? He's really considered a ruthlessly ambitious and even sadistic guy. And this is mostly how he's shown in the hagiography. But Ebroin is curious because he is the most extensively covered of all of his contemporaries, apart from Merovingian kings and queens. He actually appears in something like 11 or 12 hagiographies, which is extraordinary for a non-royal character. So what I did was I looked at 7 hagiographies in Latin, which I downloaded from the digital MGH, so nothing too fancy, right? I just downloaded the actual hagiographies and I uploaded them to a custom GPT, and I had it do networks, okay? So let's do a presentation of the Ebroin bot, and I'll show you the kinds of things that it does. Okay, so here it is, and that's actually ChatGPT. I don't want it to do ChatGPT. Let's do this instead. Yeah, and okay. Okay. So let's do this. Okay, so it goes through the actual hagiographies that I uploaded, and it mentions all the persons of interest. Okay, now how does it know who these people were? So again, on top of the actual hagiographies, I gave it some supplementary literature. So I gave it the Prosopographie der Amtsträger by Horst Ebling, which is a classical prosoprographical text published in 1974. But whenever it doesn't know the person, it is instructed to go look in the prosopography, right? So, as you can see from all of these texts, these are the persons that are mentioned, okay? So it's a pretty exhaustive list. Now let's do this. Now, show me the types of connections between these people. Visualize all this as a network. Okay? So, it's analyzing, it's thinking about everything that it does, and within a minute or so, hopefully, it should come back with an answer. Oh, and here it is. Okay? So it gives us an explanation of all the connections. And you can see these are familial connections, adversarial connections, religious connections, patronage connections, political alliance, and so on. So I can get a bird's eye view of everything that's going on in this social milieu of these nobles functioning within late 7th century Merovingian hagiography. But of course, it doesn't really only need to be hagiography, right? If I wanted, I could have uploaded the Liber Historiae Francorum, which is a historiographical text. And of course, each of you can kind of understand how this is applicable to your own field of study. Okay, so enough about that. So let's quit ChatGPT and let's go back to our presentation. Okay, and now I want to get to my final use case. And like I said in the beginning, my final use case is probably the most experimental in the sense that I don't think you can say that the outcomes of this little simulation that I'm going to run are historical in a very true sense. They're more used as a way for me going into a research field to run simulations that I can then use to think with, okay? So a lot of people come to ChatGPT thinking this is a fancy Google. It is not. It is not intended to do search. What it is intended for is to think with. It's like a very enthusiastic assistant, right, that really wants to do your bidding, but in order for it to be successful, you need to contextualize it. So you need to put it in the mind space of what it is that you're planning for it to do, okay? So this is pretty much what I did. I generated synthetic data, okay, to kind of get myself going and thinking about a historical event. So this historical event took place in February of 418. It was a significant forced conversion of the Jews of the island of Minorca under a bishop, Severus of Minorca. So this whole thing was occasioned by the coming of the relics of, I think it was St. Stephen. Yeah, it was. Okay, so I get the nod from Jerzy. I know I'm on safe ground. And what Bishop Severus did was he orchestrated a conversion of some 540 Jews, pretty much the whole community of Minorca, to Christianity during a single week. And how did he do this? Well, he didn't use AI, let's just say that. He mobilized Christians against the Jewish community. He seized and burned the synagogue. He threatened and pressured with violence. And we have a letter that he composed, which pretty much elaborates and details all of the tiny and gruesome events that led to the conversion of the population. And it really gives details about the, I guess, internal dynamics of the Jewish community. So what I wanted to do was to use what we had to generate more information and to kind of give me a sense of how these things might have unfolded, right? None of this is binding and committing historical evidence. It's more a tool for thinking about research. So I really want to put that caveat out there when we're talking about synthetic data. Because what is synthetic data, essentially? It's not historical data. It is data that is generated by the AI based on parameters and outlines that we give it, right? So it is more a tool for filling in historical lacuna. All right. So the purpose here was to create data that was unavailable, right? Sensitive, difficult to obtain, whatever. And here I decided to use a different model that's also available through ChatGPT, which is the O1 Preview. For those of you who don't know O1 Preview, it's just one of the models that ChatGPT gives you, and it is a reasoning model, okay? So most of the computation takes place not during pre-training, but during the inference phase, and if that doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry about it. I can explain it to you in the Q&A, okay? But what it means is that the bot thinks about what it does, thinks about what it says, it has a chain of thought algorithm, and then it reads its own thoughts and sees whether there are certain corrections that can be made to better the outcome, okay? So, what did I do? Well, first of all, I had it read the letter of Severus of Minorca, obviously, and I had it read some literature. And then I said, well, give me a system prompt for generating synthetic data based on all of this historical context that you now had. And so it did that. It thought about it and it generated a system prompt, which you should think about in terms of like a set of instructions for how to generate synthetic data for this particular historical context. I took this system prompt to Claude, okay? I uploaded the system prompt, I gave it the same literature, and then I said, okay, well, Claude, now go ahead and give me a data set, right? We've got 20 people, I can have him generate 20 more, or 80 more, or 200 more, whichever I want. And I can have it diversify by gender, by age, by level of education, by proximity to the power centers, whichever parameter that I choose, I can outline that I'm interested in. And then I took this set of data, this data set that was generated, and I uploaded it again to O1 Preview, and I said, okay, generate scenarios, right? What kinds of scenarios do you think would be appropriate with this kind of data? And it came back with some scenarios, and then I said, okay, now let's start rolling these scenarios. What kinds of interactions do you think these scenarios would produce? Okay? So, this is basically what the data looks like, right? I said, okay, give me a name, give me an age, gender, family role, civic role, and then I generated some spectrums of scores. So, piety score, which means how adherent this person is to Jewish traditions. Stubbornness score, which means how likely is this person to resist the pressure to convert forcibly. Conflict score, so how happy to fight is this person? Like, okay, how averse or conflict prone is this specific person? And then I did an integration score. Integration score is like how close this person might be to the centers of decision making in that specific community, right? Because you can be a very conflict-prone person, but if you're disenfranchised or living on the fringe of the society, then it doesn't really matter what you think. And then I did a tradition score. So tradition is everything that is related to adherence to, I guess, past ways of doing things that are not specifically religious. Okay, so Jewish dress, Jewish cuisine, whatever it is that it's not specifically religious. Okay? Well, yeah, I had all of the Jews that were historically attested, and then I generated on top of that another amount of Jews that are meant to reflect the kind of division that is found in the true data set. Okay? And so this is pretty much what I had to do. I will give you some data about persons active in the forceful conversion of the Jews of Minorca, look at it, and then we'll play some simulation games. Suggest some simulations that will allow me to better understand the dynamics of the affair. And this is really the crux of it. I just wanted a better understanding of how things happened, not necessarily historical proof. And then run scenario X with the relevant persons in the data set, okay? And these are the kinds of scenarios that it came up with, right? A family council simulation, a community leadership meeting, youth peer pressure simulation, economic pressure simulation, women's network influence. And for any of you studying the forceful conversion of Minorca, you know that the women were decisive in determining the outcome of, you know, that specific historical event, right? So it really interested me to see what kinds of circles that are not attested by Sergius could have played a role. Okay, there's a crisis timeline situation and an integration versus tradition dilemma. Okay, so I can run simulations, but I warn you in advance, it's going to be very textual and very long, and I don't think we'll have the opportunity to actually read it. So if you want it, I can share it with you later. Okay. So, in terms of conclusions, before we go to the actual conclusions, I want to say that I fully acknowledge these are hypothetical reconstructions. They're not historical reconstructions, and they should never be presented as historical reconstructions, but they are, so to speak, grounding scenarios, right? So they enable us to maybe think about things that we would not have thought about simply reading the primary sources, and then would prompt us to ask new and novel historical questions. So, in terms of a recap, generative AI really has the potential to upend historical research. It really kind of opens up new historical approaches, new historical avenues that were unavailable until very recently. Okay, this whole thing is 2 years old. AI is the most stupid that it's ever going to be, right? It's getting smarter and smarter every single day, right? I just talked about O1 preview. ChatGPT is teasing the full O1, which is supposed to come before the year's end. So we're before Christmas, actually. And we're already talking about AI agents, which will not be just textual, but have the ability to act on our behalf. Okay, so we really need to think carefully about how this positions us as a research community and what kinds of questions and uses we want to, right, to adopt. So if anything, what I want you to take out of this is that I invite you all to this sandbox, to this playground, to play around with these tools. The barrier to entry is very low. The tools speak perfect Polish, right? So if any of you think that language is a barrier, it is much less of a barrier than you imagine. And finally, that I will gladly provide resources or suggestions for you to get started. It is really not difficult to do, and you can reach out to me either by mail or we can set up a Zoom conversation. I just want to get people enthusiastic about all of this because as I see it, this is a watershed moment, okay, for us as historians. So I really want to thank you for your attention.